She was sold into a marriage she never wanted. He was a billionaire feared by all, but behind his cold eyes hid a man longing for love. Elena's world shattered when her own family betrayed her, forcing her to marry Caleb, a powerful stranger twice her age. But what began as a cruel arrangement slowly unraveled into something neither of them expected: healing, tenderness, and a love that defied every scar. Who is Caleb Harrington, and how did he become the man who changed everything? Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for the full story. You won't want to miss this. Elena Brooks had always known her life wasn't meant to be easy, but nothing had prepared her for the moment everything fell apart. It was a rainy Tuesday evening, the kind where the clouds pressed low over the city and the air smelled like forgotten memories. She sat by the kitchen window of her aunt and uncle's house, sketching in the corner of a crumpled notepad, trying to tune out the rising voices in the next room. Valerie and Harold, her only remaining relatives, were arguing again, something about debts, missed deadlines, and a man Maddox. Elena didn't care. She had grown used to the chaos. The shouting was part of the wallpaper in that house, like the peeling paint and the cold silences that followed every family dinner. She tucked a strand of her dark hair behind her ear, shading the edge of a mountain on her sketch, and thought about the job she'd just lost. Another cafe had closed down, third one this year. And with it went her minimum wage, her escape. Her aunt had scoffed when Elena mentioned it over dinner. "Figures," Valerie had muttered. "You've always been good at failure." But tonight, something was different. There was a stillness in the air between the shouting, something too quiet to ignore. Then came the sound of footsteps, deliberate, slow, and the door creaked open. "Elena," Harold said, his voice oddly composed, "come into the dining room. We need to talk." She hesitated, her stomach twisting with unease. She followed him into the cold room, where Valerie sat at the table with a manila folder clutched in her hand like it held a winning lottery ticket. Elena's eyes moved between their expressions, tight-lipped, strangely expectant. Valerie smiled, a brittle thing. "Sit down." She sat. "We made arrangements," Harold began, straightening his tie, though he was still in his stained undershirt. "You remember Mr. Maddox, Caleb Maddox." Elena blinked.
"The tech guy! The billionaire!"
"He's offered you, an opportunity," Valerie interrupted. "He's interested in a marriage agreement, and we've agreed." Elena's heart stilled. "You... what?" Valerie pushed the folder across the table. "He's agreed to cover our debts, pay off the mortgage, the cars, everything. In return, you marry him." The words crashed over her like icy water. "No," Elena whispered, rising from the chair. "You're not serious." "We are," Harold said coldly. "You're 23. You've lived under our roof for 8 years. We fed you, clothed you. And you think you can just sit here and draw like a child while we drown in bills?" Elena shook her head, stepping back. "You can't force me to marry someone I don't know. Someone I've never even spoken to." Valerie stood too, her voice hard. "We're not asking. You don't have a choice. You either agree to this, or you leave." Tonight, a beat of silence passed. "But why me?" Elena asked, her voice cracking. Valerie shrugged. "Apparently he likes the idea of a quiet wife. Someone without scandal." "Moldable." Elena's hands trembled. "This is trafficking. You're selling me." "It's survival," Harold snapped. "Something you've never had to worry about thanks to us." She stumbled backward, bile rising in her throat. "When?" "The wedding's in 2 weeks," Valerie said, adjusting a stack of papers. Everything's been arranged. You'll meet him tomorrow." Elena turned and fled the room, heart hammering, lungs burning. She locked herself in her tiny bedroom, the familiar four walls now pressing in like a cage. Her hands gripped the edge of the desk as her vision blurred. They were giving her away like property, like she didn't matter. She glanced at the mirror above the dresser. Her reflection stared back, brown eyes wide, lips parted in disbelief. Somewhere deep inside her, something snapped. A quiet, terrified scream that no one else could hear. But tomorrow, she'd have to face him. Caleb Maddox. The man who now held the key to her freedom. Or her prison. The morning of the wedding felt like morning. Elena stood motionless before the full-length mirror in the bridal suite. Her reflection, a stranger, draped in satin and pearls. The gown was exquisite. Maury silk that hugged her curves and spilled into a train behind her, like a ripple of moonlight. Her long, dark hair had been twisted into an intricate braid wrapped around her head, tiny pearls woven through it like constellations. Her eyes, usually sharp with quiet defiance, were soft now, clouded with disbelief. The makeup artist had done her job well. Elena looked like the picture, perfect bride. But inside she felt hollow, like a porcelain doll about to be placed on a shelf she could never leave. She hadn't slept. Her mind had spun all night, trying to untangle the web that had wrapped around her so tightly. She had met Caleb Maddox only once. An orchestrated breakfast at an upscale rooftop restaurant, where he had been polite, unreadable, and intimidatingly calm. He'd watched her like someone solving a puzzle, never smiling, never blinking longer than necessary. He didn't touch her, didn't ask anything of her. But in every glance, she felt the weight of the contract that loomed between them. This was not love. This was not choice. This was transaction. A soft knock on the door snapped her from her thoughts. Valerie stepped inside, her sharp heels tapping against the marble floor. "It's time," her aunt said, her voice clipped and smug. "Let's not keep the guests waiting." Elena didn't speak. She didn't trust her voice. Her legs moved on instinct, one foot in front of the other, as if her body had accepted a fate her heart still resisted. She reached the cathedral doors, her bouquet trembling in her hands. White roses, pure, fragile. Just like the lie this entire day had become. The music swelled as the massive oak doors opened. The scent of roses and candle wax rushed toward her like a wave. The guests turned in unison, heads craning to catch a glimpse of the bride. Elena stepped into the aisle, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The cathedral was a sea of elegance, crystal chandeliers glittering above, pale flowers lining every pew, and the soft rustle of expensive silk brushing against polished wood. And then she saw him. Caleb stood at the altar, tall and composed, dressed in a black tailored suit that molded to his broad shoulders with effortless precision. His dark hair was neatly swept back, and his piercing steel-gray eyes locked onto hers the moment she entered the room. He looked like a painting, flawless, controlled, distant. He didn't smile. His expression didn't shift, but something in the way he stood, perfectly still with his hands clasped in front of him, told her he was waiting for her, not just as a formality, but as something more. Her heart pounded so loudly it drowned out the music. Her throat closed around a silent scream. She took one shaky step after another, her vision narrowing as she approached him. Her Uncle Harold met her at the midway point. Offering his arm stiffly. She didn't want it, but she took it. Her knees threatened to buckle with each step. Finally, they reached the altar. Caleb turned slightly toward her, his expression unreadable. The priest began to speak, but the words blurred, slipping past Elena's ears like wind. "Do you, Elena Brooks, take Caleb Maddox to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Her lips parted. Nothing came out. Her eyes darted toward the pews, toward her aunt's self-satisfied smirk, toward the cameras clicking like tiny weapons. And then she looked at Caleb. He wasn't pressuring her. He wasn't reaching. He was just waiting. Quiet. Still. "I do," she whispered. Caleb reached for her hand. His touch was warm, steady, and careful, as though he knew how much she was shaking. He slid the ring onto her finger with surprising gentleness. The crowd clapped softly. Elena barely heard it. When he leaned in to kiss her, his lips didn't claim hers. Instead, they brushed against her cheek in the faintest, most respectful touch, and somehow that broke her more than any forceful kiss ever could, because it meant he saw her fear. And he let it exist. As they turned to walk back down the aisle together, Caleb's hand rested lightly against the small of her back. Elena held the bouquet tighter, her body moving beside his like a ghost floating through someone else's dream. She was now Mrs. Caleb Maddox. And she had no idea what came next. The limousine ride to Caleb's estate was cloaked in a heavy silence. Elena sat stiffly beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles pale against the ivory fabric of her gown. Outside the tinted windows, the city blurred into twilight, lights flickering on like tiny stars across a darkening canvas. She stole a glance at Caleb, who sat with perfect posture, his eyes fixed ahead. He hadn't spoken since they'd left the cathedral. Not a word. Just a quiet presence, calm and unreadable. Like a sealed door she wasn't sure she wanted to open. Her heart thudded in her chest with each mile, anticipation and dread swirling together in her stomach like a storm. The man beside her was now her husband, and yet she knew nothing of him. Only whispers. Stories of business takeovers, rumors of cold deals, articles speculating about a childhood marked by wealth and loss. He was powerful, yes. Respected, feared, but kind. Human, she didn't know. The limousine slowed, then turned through towering iron gates. Her breath caught as the estate came into view. It was nothing short of a palace, massive stone walls framed by marble pillars, with ivy curling around balconies and warm golden light spilling from every window. The driveway wrapped around a courtyard with a fountain at its center, water sparkling in the dusky glow. Caleb stepped out first, then turned to offer his hand. Elena hesitated only a moment before placing hers in his. His touch was firm, but not possessive. Like everything about him, it held control without force. She followed him through the grand entrance where staff in black uniforms bowed silently and disappeared down polished halls. The interior was breathtaking. Vaulted ceilings painted with soft frescoes, crystal chandeliers hanging like stars above them, and floors so pristine they reflected her gown as she walked. He led her upstairs, the silence between them growing louder with each step. Her heart pounded with the rhythm of their ascent. They stopped at the end of a long corridor before an arched double door. Caleb opened it, revealing a master bedroom that looked more like a royal suite. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the ocean beyond the cliffs, and a massive canopy bed stood at the center, draped in soft white linens that shimmered faintly under the chandelier's light. The room was warm, beautiful, but it felt like a gilded cage. Elena froze in the doorway. Caleb turned to her slowly. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his voice low and even. "I won't touch you, not unless you ask me to." His words struck her like a chord. She blinked, unsure she'd heard him correctly. "I know this wasn't your choice," he continued, stepping back to give her space. "And I won't pretend it was mine either. But I will never force anything on you, Elena. I promise." Her throat tightened. She hadn't expected kindness. Not from him. Not after everything. He reached into a nearby armoire, pulling out a robe of soft cream silk and laying it gently across the bed. "There's a guest room down the hall. I'll sleep there tonight." She stood frozen, her chest tight with confusion. He looked at her. Really looked. and then gave a small, respectful nod. "Good night," Caleb said softly, and then turned, walking away without another word. The door closed with a soft click, and silence swallowed the room once again. Elena stood there for a long moment, her arms wrapped around herself. The warmth of the house, the silk gown brushing her ankles, the scent of lavender from the linens. It all felt so foreign, so far from the linens. It all felt so foreign, so far from the life she knew. And yet, for the first time since she'd been forced into this marriage, she felt something shift. Not hope, not trust, but the faintest crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. She moved slowly toward the bed, her fingers brushing the edge of the robe. As she sat down, her breath trembled. Caleb Maddox, the man she'd feared, had left her alone, given her space, and offered her a choice no one else ever had. And that, somehow, frightened her even more than if he hadn't. The morning light streamed softly through the tall windows, casting golden patterns across the bedroom floor. Elena lay awake beneath the satin sheets, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her mind a tangled maze of emotions. She hadn't slept much, not because Caleb had disturbed her. He hadn't come near. True to his word, he had disappeared into the guest room the night before, leaving her in complete solitude. But even in the silence, her thoughts had been loud, circling endlessly around the same question. Why was he being so kind? She rose slowly, pulling on the silk robe he'd left for her. It felt impossibly soft against her skin, like something out of a dream. Her bare feet moved soundlessly across the polished floor as she stepped into the hallway. She didn't know what she was searching for. Perhaps answers, perhaps proof that the previous night hadn't been a fluke. The scent of coffee and something sweet drifted through the air, guiding her toward the grand staircase. As she descended, her eyes caught glimpses of the mansion's opulence. Oil paintings in gilded frames, ornate sconces lining the walls, and a massive chandelier that glittered like ice, suspended in time. She found him in the dining room, seated at the end of a long mahogany table. He was dressed in a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled to his forearms, a newspaper folded beside his untouched plate. He looked up when she entered, and for a brief moment, his expression softened in a way that made her heart stutter. "Good morning," he said, rising to his feet. "Did you sleep well?" Elena hesitated in the doorway, fingers tightening around the sash of her robe. "Well enough," she said quietly. He gestured to the seat beside him. "Join me." She stepped closer, eyes flickering to the table. Fresh croissants, cut fruit, eggs, toast, and a delicate cup of tea already steaming beside an empty plate. It was thoughtful, unnervingly so. She sat, slowly. Caleb resumed his seat, his movements calm and measured. "I thought maybe we could talk," he said after a moment, reaching for his coffee. "Not about the business or the arrangement. Just us." Elena blinked. "There is no us," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. A faint smile tugged at his lips. "Not yet," he admitted. "But I'd like there to be. Eventually." She stared at him, searching for mockery, for manipulation, but all she saw was quiet sincerity. It was disarming. "I don't understand you," she whispered. "That's fair," he replied, setting his cup down. "Most people don't. I've built a life on control, Elena. On power and strategy. But when I saw you, I realized I didn't want this marriage to be just another business deal. You deserved more than that." Elena's throat tightened. "Then why agree to it?" He looked away, jaw tightening. Because I didn't know what else to do. Your aunt and uncle, they made it clear that if I didn't help them, they'd ruin you. I couldn't let that happen. Shock rippled through her chest. You? Did this for me? I did it because I couldn't stand the idea of someone like you being used by people like them. Her breath caught, her hands trembling in her lap. She had been so sure Caleb was just another man buying control. But now, hearing this, seeing the flicker of pain in his eyes, it unraveled something inside her. Thank you, she said quietly, the words foreign on her tongue. Caleb met her gaze. You don't have to thank me, Elena. I'm not asking for anything in return. Not your affection, not your affest, just time. Let me prove that I'm not the villain in this story. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the clink of silverware and the distant hum of the ocean outside. Finally, Elena reached for her tea, her hands still shaking slightly. All right, she said softly. Time. And in that moment, something shifted between them. Not love, not even trust, but perhaps the beginning of something that could one day become both. The days that followed unfolded like a delicate truce, fragile, uncertain, yet somehow comforting in its quiet rhythm. Elena found herself settling into the mansion's strange serenity, its marble halls and sun-drenched balconies becoming less intimidating and more familiar. She spent her mornings walking the garden paths, her fingertips brushing the petals of roses so perfectly groomed they almost didn't feel real. In the afternoons, she read in the library, its walls lined with leather-bound books and the soft scent of old paper. And in the evenings, she shared quiet dinners with Caleb, always at the same long table, always with a gentle distance between them. He never rushed her. He never touched her without invitation. And yet, she felt his presence in everything. The warmth of her tea waiting each morning, the cozy blanket draped over her shoulders when she read too long into the night, the quiet way he listened when she spoke, even if it was just a simple observation about the weather. It unnerved her, this tenderness, because she'd been raised in a world where kindness was currency, used, spent, and often ripped away. Her aunt and uncle had taught her that everything came at a cost, that affection was a leash, and warmth could be snatched back the moment you let your guard down. But Caleb didn't fit that mold. It was late one evening and something shifted. They had just finished dinner, and Elena lingered by the tall windows of the sitting room, watching the rain slide down the glass. The storm outside was soft but persistent, filling the space with a gentle rhythm that made her chest ache with something she couldn't name. Caleb entered quietly, 2 steaming mugs in hand. Chamomile, he said, offering one to her. You mentioned it helps you sleep. She took the mug, her fingers brushing his. You remember everything I say? She murmured. He gave a small smile. Only the important parts. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling softly behind them. Caleb settled into the armchair across from her, one leg crossed over the other, the flicker of flame light casting golden shadows along the sharp planes of his face. He looked tired, maybe even a little worn. But there was something open in his expression that made her chest tighten. Elena, he said quietly, may I ask you something personal? She hesitated. Depends how personal. He looked down at the mug in his hand. You mentioned once that your parents died when you were 15. Her breath hitched, but she didn't speak. I lost mine around that age too, he continued, his voice steady but distant. Different circumstances, but the silence after. It's the same, isn't it? Elena looked up, her eyes meeting his. There was no pity in his gaze, only understanding, and that, more than anything, made her want to speak. "It never goes away," she whispered. "That silence. It follows you into adulthood, into every relationship, every moment that should be happy." Caleb nodded slowly, and every time something good happens, you wonder if you're allowed to feel it. Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. She looked away quickly, wiping at her cheek. "I don't usually cry in front of people." "Then don't think of me as people," he said gently. She laughed, a soft, watery sound. "That's probably the strangest comfort I've ever received." "But did it work?" he asked, tilting his head. She nodded, eyes shining. "A little." He stood slowly, crossing the room with unhurried steps. He stopped just beside her, but didn't reach for her, didn't pressure her. Just stood there, like an invitation she could either accept or ignore. Elena looked up at him. "You can sit here," she whispered. He lowered himself beside her on the velvet couch, the space between them small, still respectful. For a while, they didn't speak. Just sat, listening to the rain. Then, without thinking, Elena leaned her head against his shoulder. Caleb stiffened slightly, then relaxed, his body warm and solid beneath hers. "You make it easier to breathe," she said softly. Caleb's breath caught, barely audible, before his arm slowly moved around her back, his hand resting lightly on her waist. "And you make it easier to hope." And in the quiet hush of that rainy night, something unspoken bloomed between them. Not love, not yet, but something far more dangerous. Trust. Elena stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, her reflection barely recognizable. The silk dress Caleb had picked for her clung gently to her curves, its soft emerald hue bringing out the deep brown in her eyes. Her hair was swept into an elegant updo, delicate curls framing her face. She looked every bit the image of a billionaire's wife. But inside, her heart beat with growing dread. Tonight, her aunt and uncle would be attending Caleb's formal charity gala, a night designed to impress, to show the world that Elena had become someone. Only she wasn't sure who that someone, she wasn't sure who that someone was anymore. Downstairs, the estate buzzed with preparations. Staff moved with quick precision, arranging fresh flowers, polishing crystal, and lining the marble halls with soft golden light. Caleb was already dressed, waiting near the grand staircase in a black tuxedo that sharpened his already commanding presence. When Elena descended the steps, his eyes met hers and didn't waver. "You look," he paused, his voice slightly husky, "extraordinary." Elena forced a smile. "Thank you." He offered his arm, and she took it, trying not to let the tremor in her hand show. "They're already here," he said softly. "Robert and Marla." Her stomach twisted at the sound of their names. It had been weeks since she'd seen them, and even now the thought of facing them filled her with a sickening cocktail of fear and resentment. She had changed, yes, but they hadn't. They were still the ones who had sold her future for a quick profit, who had looked her in the eye and told her she had no choice. As they entered the grand ballroom, Elena felt 1,000 eyes turn their way. She kept her chin high, her fingers gripping Caleb's arm just a little tighter. The music swelled, violins dancing through the air as servers passed with trays of champagne. Caleb whispered occasional introductions as they made their way across the room, but Elena barely heard them. Her eyes were already searching, scanning, for the pair of faces she dreaded most. And then she saw them. Robert, stiff and self-important in his ill-fitting tuxedo, and Marla, her smile stretched unnaturally wide as she clung to the arm of some lesser-known investor. They noticed her almost instantly. Marla's gaze swept over Elena with narrowed eyes, taking in the designer dress, the radiant glow she hadn't possessed under their roof. And Robert, his expression soured with something that looked disturbingly like envy. "Well, look who's finally playing her part," Marla said as they approached, her voice syrupy and sharp. "Didn't she clean up nicely, Robert?" Elena felt the muscles in her jaw clench. Caleb's hand slipped subtly over hers, grounding her. "You've done well for yourself," Robert said, eyes flickering to Caleb. "Didn't think you had it in you, Elena. I must admit, we were a little worried you'd ruin the opportunity." "She didn't ruin anything," Caleb said, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "In fact, she's the reason this evening is a success. The guest list, the desk list, the decor, Elena organized it all." Marla's smile faltered just slightly. "She's always been good with the softer details," Marla murmured. "Not just that," Caleb continued, now turning toward Elena. "She's intelligent, resourceful, and more poised than anyone else in this room, including you, Marla." The air around them tightened. Elena blinked, stunned by the sudden defense. For the first time in years, someone had stood up for her, not because they had to, not out of guilt, but because they wanted to. Robert's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake, Caleb. Trusting her too much." "No," Caleb replied, voice low and even. "The mistake was yours. Underestimating her." Elena felt her breath catch. The tension between the four of them was electric. Her heart pounded, her fingers curled tightly around her clutch. She looked at Marla, at Robert, and saw not power, but fear. Fear that the girl they once controlled had become something they could no longer manipulate. "I suggest you enjoy the evening," Caleb added coolly, "and stay out of my wife's way." With that, he guided Elena away, his hand never leaving hers. Once they were out of earshot, Elena turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do that?" Caleb looked at her, his expression serious. "Because no one gets to belittle you again. Not while I'm here." A lump rose in her throat. She didn't answer. She couldn't. But as she slipped her hand more firmly into his, Elena realized something had shifted deep within her. She wasn't afraid of them anymore. Not with Caleb beside her. Elena woke to the sound of glass shattering. She bolted upright in bed, her heart slamming against her ribs. For a moment, she was disoriented, lost between the hazy comfort of sleep and the icy chill of dread spreading through her chest. The room was still cloaked in early morning shadows, the soft blue hue of dawn barely creeping past the drawn curtains. Then came the muffled voices, loud, angry, male. She slipped out of bed and padded barefoot across the polished floor, wrapping the silk robe tightly around her as she crept toward the door. Cracking it open, she caught the sound of Caleb's voice rising from the grand foyer below, sharp and cutting in a way she had never heard before. "I told you not to show up here," he growled. "I don't take orders from you," another voice snapped back, this one unfamiliar but laced with entitlement. "You married her. That makes this my business." Elena's stomach sank. She crept quietly down the stairs, her fingers grazing the railing as she descended. Halfway down, she froze, the sight below stealing her breath. A man stood opposite Caleb, tall, well-dressed, in an expensive wool coat, his dark hair swept back in polished waves. He looked familiar, hauntingly so. His eyes flicked up, sharp and calculating, and they landed on Elena like a vulture spotting prey. "Ah," he said smoothly, "speak of the devil." Caleb stepped in front of the man, his voice now laced with menace. You don't talk to her. Elena finally reached the bottom of the stairs, her voice barely above a whisper. Who is he? The man turned to her, his smile cold. Oh, she doesn't know. Now that's rich. He took a step toward her, ignoring the warning glare from Caleb. I'm Theo. Her ex-fiance. The air in the room vanished. Elena's world tilted. No, she said, shaking her head slowly. Theo moved away. Years ago, Theo's smile widened. You really think I left for no reason? You think your aunt and uncle just decided to marry you off to someone else? Sweetheart, I was part of the plan from the beginning. Caleb's jaw clenched. Get out. But Theo ignored him, his eyes fixed on Elena, amusement dancing in them like fire. You were supposed to be my ticket to a fortune. But then this guy comes along, flashing more money and better suits, and suddenly your loving guardians cut me out of the deal, said you were more valuable married to him. Elena felt the room spin. Her hands trembled. You knew they were selling me off? Of course I knew, Theo said with a shrug. Hell, I suggested it. Caleb's fist clenched so tightly, Elena could see the tension in his forearm. You used her. Theo laughed, stepping back casually. Don't act so righteous. You married her, didn't you? Don't pretend this was some fairy tale. We both know how this started. Caleb stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. Yes, I married her. But I never treated her like a product. And I sure as hell didn't betray her. Theo's smile slipped. You think you've won. That because she's living in your big house and wearing your diamonds, she loves you. She's still the same scared girl they manipulated. She doesn't know how to survive without someone pulling her strings. Elena's voice cut through the room like glass. You're wrong. Both men turned toward her. I'm not that girl anymore, she said. Her voice steady despite the storm churning inside her. And I never needed you to survive. You were just another person trying to control me. She stepped beside Caleb, her hand finding his. But he didn't pull strings. He gave me a choice, and I chose him. Theo's expression twisted, part fury, part disbelief. You'll regret this. No, Caleb said, stepping forward. You will. Security appeared at the edge of the foyer, summoned silently by Caleb. Theo's eyes narrowed, but he backed away with a sneer. Enjoy your fairy tale, Elena. It won't last. And then he was gone. The door slammed shut, leaving silence in his wake. Elena stood frozen for a moment, her chest heaving, tears stinging the corners of her eyes. But she didn't let them fall. Caleb turned to her, his hands gentle as they cupped her face. Are you okay? She nodded shakily. I think I finally am. And for the first time, she meant it. The days following Theo's intrusion were tense. Elena found herself constantly glancing over her shoulder, her sleep haunted by memories of the confrontation and the bitter truths he'd unearthed. But what surprised her most wasn't the fear. It was Caleb. He hadn't treated her like a fragile thing needing protection. He hadn't hovered or demanded to know what she was thinking. Instead, he remained a steady presence, never pressing, always nearby. And it was in that silence, that space he gave her, that something within Elena began to shift. Late one evening, she stood at the balcony outside their bedroom, the breeze cool against her skin. Below, the city stretched like a sea of stars, but it was Caleb's voice that brought her back from the maze of her thoughts. You're quiet tonight. She turned. He was leaning against the doorframe, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, the top buttons undone. He looked tired, but not the kind of tired that came from work. It was deeper, worn, wary. "I'm thinking," she said softly. Caleb approached, stopping beside her. "I keep asking myself," she began, her voice barely audible, "what would have happened if I had just run that night? If I'd tried to escape instead of walking down that aisle? You'd probably be living in a rundown apartment, eating cereal for dinner," he replied quietly. "And I'd still be the cold-hearted CO everyone pretends to admire." She glanced at him, startled by the honesty in his voice. "I didn't want this, Caleb," she said, her throat tight. "Any of it. I didn't want to be someone's wife for show. I didn't want to belong to anyone." "I know," he murmured. "And you don't. You don't belong to anyone. Not even me." Elena's breath caught. "I'm not asking you to love me," he said. "But if you ever do, I want it to be your choice. Not because of pity or obligation. Not because of what they did to you." She looked at him, her chest aching. "Why are you so patient with me?" Caleb turned to face her fully, his hand lifting to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "Because I've spent most of my life making decisions that benefited me alone. I stepped on people, ignored feelings, avoided attachments, and then you showed up at the altar like a storm I didn't see coming. I thought you were just another piece on the board. But you changed everything." His words sank into her like sunlight warming frozen skin. "You think I'm strong?" she said, more to herself than to him. "I know you are," he whispered. "They tried to break you, and you're still here, still fighting." The tears welled before she could stop them, but she didn't look away. She didn't hide. "I hated you," she whispered. "I deserved it," he replied. "And now, I don't." His brows knit. "Don't what?" "Hate you." A silence fell between them, heavy, real. "I'm scared," she admitted, "because the last time I trusted someone, they used me." Caleb's fingers brushed hers. "Then let me be different." Her heart pounded as she slowly slid her hand into his. "What if I fall?" "I'll catch you," he said, not hesitating. In that moment, the air around them seemed to still. The city lights, the wind, the soft hum of distant traffic. It all faded. There was only him, only her, and the space they chose to fill together. Elena took a shaky breath, then stepped closer, resting her forehead gently against his chest. Caleb's arms came around her carefully, as though he was holding something fragile but precious. "I'm not ready to say it," she whispered. "You don't have to," he said into her hair. "I can wait." She let herself breathe in the scent of him. Warm, clean, familiar now. Her fingers curled against the fabric of his shirt. "But I want to try," she said softly. "I want to see what we could become." Caleb pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. "Then we start there." And for the first time, Elena didn't feel trapped by a marriage she never asked for. She felt free inside it. It had started with a single photograph. Elena had been organizing some of the older files in the home office when she stumbled across a locked drawer. She didn't think much of it until curiosity got the better of her. She found the key tucked behind a book on the highest shelf, right where James had once told her he kept important documents. When the drawer clicked open, She expected to find old contracts or ledgers. Instead, her breath caught at the sight of a thick manila envelope, marked only with her name in bold black ink. Inside were dozens of photos, some taken years ago, some more recent, all of her, at the university library, walking to work, sitting alone in a cafe, even one from the day she had cried quietly by her mother's grave, thinking no one had been there. Her blood ran cold. They were too clear to be accidental, too intentional. Some were marked with scribbled dates and notes in handwriting she didn't recognize. Notes like, "She's becoming more independent," or "Still visits the cemetery. Emotional vulnerability remains." Her hands trembled as she flipped through them. What was this? Who had been watching her? Footsteps sounded behind her, and she spun around, heart in her throat. Caleb stood at the threshold, his expression unreadable, the light from the hallway casting long shadows across his face. "You weren't supposed to see those," he said quietly. Elena stared at him, her fingers tightening around the photos. "You knew?" Caleb didn't move. "I hired someone watch over you, a long time ago." "Watch over me," she repeated, her voice rising. "Caleb, this isn't protection. This is surveillance, obsession." "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it?" she snapped, shoving the photos toward him. "Explain this to me. Why were you keeping tabs on me like I was some experiment?" Caleb took a step forward, but Elena flinched back, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. "Don't," she warned, her voice breaking. His jaw tightened, but he stopped. "After your uncle and aunt approached me with their proposal, I didn't trust them. Something about it felt wrong. They were too eager to sell you off. I needed to know who you were. So you decided to stalk me instead of just meeting me like a normal person." Her eyes were brimming with tears now, hot and confused. "All this time, I thought we were building something real. I thought we were building something real. And now I find out you've been watching me like I'm some—" "I stopped after the wedding," he said, voice rough. "I didn't want to violate your trust. But yes, I started off thinking of this as a deal, like everything else in my life. But then I saw you, and his voice faltered. "You weren't what I expected." "You mean I wasn't broken enough to be manipulated?" she asked bitterly. "No," he snapped. "I mean you were more than I expected, stronger, smarter, kinder. And yes, I was afraid of ruining that. I made a mistake, Elena. I won't lie to you and say it wasn't. But it didn't come from a place of cruelty. It came from fear." Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. "Fear of what?" "Of falling for you before I even met you," he said. "Of not being enough for someone like you." She stared at him, stunned. Her heart wanted to believe him, to cling to the pieces of tenderness they had built together. But her mind screamed at her to run. "I don't know if I can trust you anymore," she whispered. Caleb nodded, his shoulders sagging. "I'll earn it back. Whatever it takes." Elena turned away, the photographs clutched tightly in her hand. She didn't say another word as she walked past him and up the stairs. Behind her, she heard nothing but silence. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Her mind ran wild with memories, doubts, and the weight of betrayal. And yet, she couldn't forget the way Caleb had looked at her, not with power or possession, but with quiet desperation. A man who knew he'd crossed a line, but still hoped he could find his way back. As dawn crept over the horizon, Elena sat by the window, the photos scattered around her like fragments of a broken truth. Her heart ached, but something in her gut whispered that this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the reckoning, The days that followed passed in a fog of silence. Elena barely spoke to Caleb, though he never once pressured her to talk. He kept his distance, retreating quietly into his work and sleeping in the guest room without question. She could hear the creak of the hallway floorboards late at night when he passed her door, only to pause for a moment, never knocking, never knocking, never knocking, never pushing, before disappearing again into the shadows. But it was his absence that made his presence more unbearable. The mansion felt too large, too hollow. She caught herself reaching for her phone to text him about something she'd read, only to stop midway. She thought of his quiet gestures, the morning tea he used to prepare just the way she liked it, the books he had left on her nightstand with notes in the margins, the rare, fleeting smile that softened the hard lines of his face when he looked at her. All of it gnawed the edges of her anger. Then came the envelope. It arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, slid under her door. Elena stared at it for a long time before picking it up. Inside was a simple handwritten note. "I'll be at the lake house until Sunday. If you choose not to come, I'll understand. But if there's anything left in you that believes in what we could become, I'll wait. No questions, no expectations. No expectations. Just truth." She should have torn it up, should have stayed put. But instead, Elena packed a small bag and left that same evening. The lake house stood nestled beneath towering pines, its glass walls reflecting the gentle shimmer of the water. She found Caleb sitting on the porch, his elbows on his knees, his hands laced together as he stared at the still lake. He didn't hear her at first, not until her footsteps crunched softly against the wooden boards. He turned. His eyes were tired, darker than she remembered, and yet they held something she hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. "You came," he said simply. "I don't know why," she admitted. "You don't have to know," he said quietly. "Just sit with me." So she did. For a long while, they didn't speak. The water lapped gently against the shore. The wind rustled through the trees. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, full of all the things they didn't know how to say. Finally, Elena broke it. "I don't know how to move past what you did." Caleb nodded slowly. "I don't expect you to." "Then why did you ask me to come here?" "Because I needed you to know," he said, his voice steady, "that everything changed after you walked into my life. That I'm not proud of how this started. That I made choices out of fear and control. But I made choices out of fear and control. But I'm done hiding from that." She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time saw not just the composed billionaire, but a man stripped bare, one who had made mistakes, one who had made mistakes, one who was desperately trying to be better. "I hated you," she said softly. "I hated myself too," he murmured. Her chest tightened. "But I also—" She paused, the words catching in her throat. "I also felt safe with you. And that's what makes this harder." Caleb's hands clenched. "I know. I wanted to believe you were the one good thing in all of this," she whispered. "That after everything, I had finally found someone who saw me, not just used me." He turned toward her slowly, his voice cracking. "You are the one good thing, Elena. You're the only thing that ever made any of this worth it." She swallowed hard, her throat aching. "Then show me. Don't say it. Show me who you really are, without the lies, without the power games. Just you." He nodded. "I will." She stood, her voice trembling. "I'll wait," he said, standing beside her. "For as long as it takes." As the wind moved softly through the trees and the lake shimmered beneath the setting sun, Elena took one step forward, then another. She didn't fall into his arms. She didn't say the words he longed to hear. But she stayed. And for Caleb, that was enough. For now. The weeks that followed were a quiet rebuilding. Elena didn't move back into Caleb's room, and he didn't ask her to. Instead, he focused on small, consistent gestures, acts that spoke louder than apologies. Every morning, she'd find fresh coffee waiting outside her door, sometimes with a note, sometimes just a flower clipped from the garden. He never hovered, never tried to force conversations, but his presence was always felt. In the way the hallway lights were left on for her. The books he left on for her, the books he left on the table, and the way he disappeared into the background, just enough to give her space, but never made her feel alone. It was a strange balance, the space between them, tense and tender all at once. One afternoon, Elena found herself wandering through the quiet halls of the estate, her fingertips grazing the cool marble banister as memories from the early days came rushing back. The day she'd arrived with trembling hands, the heavy gown on her wedding day, the cold fear in her chest when she first saw Caleb at the altar. She paused at the top of the staircase, watching the sunlight pour in through the tall windows. How far they had come, and yet, how far they still had to go. In the library, she found him. Caleb sat on the edge of the leather armchair, papers in his lap, glasses perched low on his nose. He looked older in that moment, worn down not by age, but by the weight of everything unsaid between them. "You always disappear here," she said, her voice quiet. He looked up slowly, his expression unreadable at first, until his eyes softened, vulnerable in a way that still caught her off guard. "Books, don't ask questions. I can't answer." Elena stepped further into the room, her fingers brushing over the spine of a worn volume on the shelf. "I used to escape into stories too. When I was little." "I know," he said, and then paused. "I mean, I remember. One of the first things I learned about you was how you used to read under the old oak tree in the cemetery." She blinked, surprised. "I didn't think you kept any of that." "I tried to forget it," he said honestly. "Because the more I knew, the harder it was to pretend this wasn't real." Silence stretched between them. Then, carefully, Elena sat across from him, folding her legs beneath her. "I don't know how to fall back into this," she admitted. "I don't even know if I should." "You shouldn't," Caleb said immediately, and her eyes narrowed slightly in confusion. But he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You shouldn't fall back into anything that doesn't make you feel like yourself. I don't want to go back to what we were. I want to build something new, something honest. No secrets, no control." Her throat tightened at the sincerity in his voice. "And what if I say, I still don't trust you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then I'll spend every day earning it," he replied. "Not with grand gestures or promises, but with truth. With presence." For the first time in a long while, Elena didn't look away. Her gaze held his, searching for the cracks in his mask, and what she saw wasn't perfection. It was exhaustion, guilt, humility, the kind of love that didn't demand, didn't cage, but waited, patient and quiet. "You never gave up," she murmured. "I couldn't," he said, voice low, "because even when I didn't deserve you, I still loved you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she stood and walked toward him, each step slow, deliberate. When she reached his chair, she hesitated for a heartbeat, then gently reached for his hand. His breath caught. Elena didn't say anything else. She just stood there holding his hand, letting the silence speak for her. And when Caleb's fingers curled softly around hers, grounding her. She felt it, that familiar warmth blooming in her chest again. No promises, no rushing. Just the beginning of something real. It was nearly sunset when Caleb took her hand and led her outside. The sky was painted in strokes of amber and rose, the horizon melting into gold as the last light of day kissed the estate's sprawling gardens. Elena walked beside him in silence, her fingers laced with his, her pulse strangely calm. For once, there was no storm in her chest, just the steady hum of peace that had begun to take root over the last few weeks. They stopped at the edge of the lake, the water reflecting the fading light like a sheet of glass. A small table was set beneath a canopy of fairy lights, simple and intimate. 2 chairs, a bottle of wine, her favorite dessert already waiting on delicate porcelain plates. Elena smiled softly, eyes narrowing with amusement. "You're not going to propose again, are you?" Caleb laughed under his breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "Tempting," he murmured, then looked at her, his gaze tender. "But no, tonight is just for us. No expectations." They sat, and for a while they talked like old friends, about books, travel, her dreams, his regrets. There were still pauses, still places where the pain hadn't fully healed, but they didn't avoid them anymore. They let the quiet fill those spaces. After dinner, they stayed by the lake, Elena leaning into him as he wrapped his arm gently around her shoulders. The breeze was cool, and her hair danced around her face, catching the light. She tilted her head up, studying him as he stared out at the water. "You look different," she said, her voice low. He glanced down at her, brow raised. "Different how?" "Lighter," she said, "like you're not carrying the whole world on your back anymore." He nodded slowly, his fingers brushing over her hand. "Because I'm not." Her heart twisted at the truth in his words. It had taken so long. Caleb shifted to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I don't know what our future looks like, Elena," he said carefully, "but I know I want you in it. However you choose to be." "I'm scared," she admitted, eyes glistening. "Not of you." "You don't have to have all the answers," he said gently. "Just stay. Just keep choosing this." Elena looked down at their hands, at the way his thumb brushed over hers, slow and steady. She remembered the girl who had once stood trembling at the altar, forced into a life she didn't want. And now here she was, still uncertain, still healing, but choosing to stay. "I think I'm finally ready," she whispered. Caleb's breath caught, his fingers tightening around hers. "Ready for what?" "To stop running," she said, looking up at him. "To start living this life like it's mine. Not one I was traded into." A soft, almost disbelieving smile touched his lips. "You don't know how long I've waited to hear that." She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. "Then stop waiting," she whispered. Their kiss was gentle, unhurried. It wasn't the frantic, desperate kind they had shared in their most vulnerable moments. It was grounded, soft, real. The kind of kiss that said, "We made it through," that whatever came next, they'd face it together. Later that night, as they lay curled together beneath the stars, Caleb whispered into her hair, "You saved me, Elena." "From myself." She smiled against his chest. "We saved each other." And it was true. What began as a prison had become a sanctuary. What started with betrayal had blossomed into something unshakable. Love, not born from perfection, but from persistence, from choice. As the moon rose above the lake and the world grew quiet around them, Elena closed her eyes, her hand resting over his heart. It beat steady beneath her palm, strong and sure, and for the first time in a long time, she knew, without fear, without doubt, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Forever. The story of Elena and Caleb teaches us a powerful lesson about resilience, choice, and the true meaning of love. Sometimes, life places us in situations we never asked for. Painful, unfair, even terrifying. But within those moments, we discover who we really are. Elena was forced into a life she never chose, used as a means to an end by the very people who should have protected her. And yet, through heartbreak and fear, she found her strength. Not by fighting fire with fire, but by holding onto her humanity. Caleb, too, carried scars of his own. Hardened by a world that demanded power over peace, he learned that love isn't about control or expectation. It's about patience, respect, and showing up day after day, even when the other person can't do the same yet. Together, they remind us that love doesn't have to start perfectly to become something beautiful. It doesn't bloom overnight, and it doesn't ignore the wounds we carry. Real love is a slow unfolding, a daily choice to stay, to listen, to forgive, and to heal side by side. No matter where we come from or what we've been through, we all deserve a chance at a love that sees us, protects us, and believes in us even when we can't believe in ourselves. If this story touched your heart or made you think about love and life in a deeper way, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thank you for being here. And remember, love always starts with courage.